Welcome to the Executive Compensation Podcast. On this show, we discuss all aspects of executive compensation. Whether you're a compensation committee member, a seasoned compensation professional, or just curious to learn more about executive compensation, this show is the answer. Each episode brings you a focused and actionable interview on specific topics of executive compensation. This episode is brought to you by Meridian Compensation Partners. Meridian works with compensation committees to ensure the most effective processes are in place to go beyond mere compliance with governance requirements and create healthy, dynamic relationships between the board, management, and its advisors. Meridian helps boards use compensation to attract and retain critical talent and to make informed business decisions that will link pay and performance, drive business results, increase shareholder value, and mitigate potential risks. Learn more at meridiancp.com. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Executive Compensation Podcast. Today I am joined by Christina Medland and Matthew Isakson of Meridian Compensation Partners to discuss the topic of expansion of compensation committee oversight. Thank you for joining us today, Christina and Matthew.
Thank you very much for having us.
Thanks for having us, Jake.
To start off with an initial question here, are you seeing an increased focus by compensation committees on broader ESG issues?
Actually, we are. It's become quite a noticeable trend over the last couple of years. And we're seeing the traditional compensation committee now start to focus on a much broader array of different topics. I would say that this started about probably 4 or 5 years ago with committees focusing increasingly on succession planning and then expanding that to talent development. But more recently, with all of the pushes that we've been seeing on diversity, equity, and inclusion and increased focus on human capital metrics, that we're seeing a much more rapid and more significant expansion of the committee oversight role.
Chris, I would agree that it's been pretty amazing to see just how quickly this has scaled up here. And it's hard to point to any clients that are not at least having a conversation about these broader ESG impacts and where do they go from here. Completely agree.
That's great. And so what, in your guys' view, what is driving this trend and change?
It's interesting, Jake, because if you think about this, as Chris said, this has been a slow burn for quite 3-4 years on these broader issues. But it's hard to really find many topics like ESG and focus on compensation committees that has gotten so popular so quickly here over time. And it's really about a couple factors, and you can think about the broader societal impacts that we've seen in the United States, the media attention on these types of issues, ESG, whether it's environmental, societal, et cetera. But then it also just tears down from there. You have your large institutional investors speaking out about it, and when you have funds like BlackRock, State Street, et cetera, speaking about this, people listen. And then after that, of course, comes the proxy advisors, ISS and Glass Lewis. So you're getting this momentum here that's been building, at least in this country, in the United States and others, over the last 12 months. And then more formally, and most recently, is probably the SEC. So it's made it more of a formal requirement. The SEC in November of 2020 made a formal requirement for companies to actually discuss human capital metrics management, human capital management in their 10K disclosures, if they are material to understanding the business. So that put more of the formality on this focus of specifically human capital metrics, but within the realm of a broader ESG umbrella. So that was more the formal undertaking here, but it's been interesting to see how quickly. And then most recently, you've had the new SEC chair, Gary Gensler, say that his priorities, at least in questioning when he came on board and got confirmed by the Senate, was really around expanding human capital management disclosure, getting more formal ESG disclosure. So this is on the minds of not only the regulators, your investors, society. So this is really, you just have really seen this move quite quickly. And Chris, I'd be interested to see if you're seeing this similar in Canada or just what your experience across your clients are.
We're seeing something really quite similar, and I would say there's two kind of different pushes on this right now. One of them is just a broader attention focus on enterprise risk management and making sure that there is a home for key issues of risk. And the other thing that COVID has certainly done is put more emphasis on other aspects of the work relationship and on human capital. So we've seen significantly increased focus on employee wellness. We have seen companies paying attention to flexible and remote work arrangements. And these issues are, along with a number of other COVID-driven things, have really been accelerating the pace of change on our employees matter, our workforce matters. We need to make sure that we're dealing appropriately with it.
So what I'm hearing from you guys is that really all the events of 2020 essentially accelerated a lot of these trends by having the big names start to speak about this, start to pay attention to this, which then led to regulation and compliance boards starting to look at this. And then this is basically putting pressure on corporations to really start to figure out and take in actions on this. Is that accurate?
Well said.
Yeah, I think so. And I would say companies were doing this already, but as Matt noted, it's become more formal, more formalized.
Yeah, and so what effects is this actually having on compensation committees?
They're certainly working a whole lot harder than they ever have in the past. And I would say this has been typically a pretty hardworking committee at most companies. We're seeing compensation committees now spend more of their time on these critical issues. So meeting agendas are getting longer, they're getting more complex. We're increasingly seeing specific oversight to the compensation committee on what the company is doing in terms of disclosure, because so much of how companies are judged or rated is really based on what they publicly disclose, more so than what they're actually doing. It's changing the composition sometimes of the compensation committee meetings. We now regularly see presentations by the chief diversity officer or the chief sustainability officer coming in front of the compensation committee. Lots more reports going to the committee. So the reports we now see, what might have been a traditional report on safety is now a report on employee wellness, employee mental health, what the company is doing to help support employees. It's really expanded what it is the committees are asking management to report on. We're also seeing much more detailed and in-depth reports on workforce demographics, gender and racial diversity, and sophisticated clients are doing things like analyzing whether differences in pay are attributable to important factors like tenure in the role, educational background, or whether there is some risk that they are based on gender or race. And we're seeing that not just with pay levels, but with high potential designations and also performance ratings. So we're seeing a really quite holistic look at, is there anything in how we're dealing with our people that is unintentionally actually supporting unequal treatment of people doing similar work? And I guess the last part of this is that the work of the compensation committee is getting less transactional. So what are we going to pay people? And a whole lot more strategic, because moving the needle on some of these issues is a much longer term. You need to be planful, you need to stay committed, and you need to be making progress. So we're seeing these much more as what kind of progress are we making, and more focus on where the company is trying to go and less on what's the right decision for today.
I think Chris hit on two key points here. One is oversight. So the committee is not seen to strategy, setting strategy on human capital or ESG metrics, at least from what we see, but it's oversight, guidance that they're giving the management team. And I think that's an important distinction for compensation committees. They're not there managing the day-to-day process. They're getting input. These conversations have been fantastic with the chief diversity officer or equivalent at companies. but they're really getting the oversight and pushing the management teams appropriately. The other is the complexity. And I know that I'll speak for myself here, Chris, but the complexity of these issues runs deep, and the analytics that it requires to just get your head around, let's just say, changing representation and looking at companies and how analytically they have to look at their attrition rates, their hire rates, and what it takes to actually move the needle. So it becomes more of the theoretical, everyone's trying to do the right thing, to how do we actually do it and implement it on a practical basis, and what efforts it actually takes. So I think the oversight and the complexity that Chris hit on can't really be understated here, what committees are dealing with.
Yeah, and I know we've talked in previous episodes just about the challenge of these metrics being much longer term targets. With a financial target, it's something you can easily measure in a year, but it sounds like this is making it a lot different when you can't completely change the makeup of a company or the sustainability impact in a 12-month period, which adds a whole nother level of complexity for committees as well to figure out how to measure with these as well.
That's right, Jake. And just as a shameless plug here, finished an initial study on the use of ESG metrics in annual incentive and long-term incentive plans across the S&P 500. What's interesting is that you're seeing it predominantly in the annual incentive plan. And to your point of this is a long-term measure, Chris, what was it, 5-6% of companies have it in long-term incentives at this point? And so this is clearly a long-term measure, but I'm not sure companies really have their arms around how to impact this over the long term. So that could be an area to watch here in the near term.
That's great. And are there any other formal changes being made at the committee level or at the moment as a result of all of this?
I'd say the formal changes start first with the committee name. And there's a lot of effort to go into what is our name? What does this imply? What could people infer from our committee name? The traditional name is the Compensation Committee. We're seeing more and more companies bring in the word talent, succession, management, culture, whatever issue. But one or two words is getting a lot of attention from committees about how to actually change it. So whether it's the talent, culture, and compensation committee. So they're getting longer. They're really trying to send a message, at least from my experience, Chris, of what other areas are they starting to touch on? We're just not focused on compensation, but culture is a whole very complex issue. And do you want to put that in? Do you want to signal that now the compensation committee has oversight of culture? So you're seeing that on a formal basis. It starts with, you would say, the name, then it gets into the charter if the company views it that's appropriate. So then it's mandating that the company's having some review or oversight of human capital. And that's a whole other discussion, but putting it in the charter, because that's not currently required by the NYSE or NASDAQ on how to to actually have that in your compensation committee charter. And then lastly, the work plan. So how does the work get done? And this loops back to Chris's point of, okay, we say we're going to do this. Now, how do we actually do it per year? Where does it fit into the work plan? We already have very full agendas. Where do we carve out time for this now important topic? But those are the more formal pieces of it, and what Chris went through is the nuts and bolts of how companies are actually doing it, I would say.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, Matt. And on the sort of the strategic part of this, we're seeing companies now even add an extra meeting, and maybe a meeting in kind of the late spring or the early summer, because they just don't have enough time in their regular calendar to add a whole lot more work to this. And the more strategic and important but less urgent or immediately time-sensitive nature means that this topic often gets put in a meeting where there's less transactional work to do. So I agree with absolutely with what you've said about this.
That's great. And then are really all matters of ESG being allocated to the compensation committee at this point? Are they responsible for all of it, or where do the lines be drawn?
So it's interesting because we think of ESG as a sort of a single concept, but it really is the E, which is environmental, the S, which used to be sustainability and is now social, and the G is governance. And what we're seeing at thoughtful committees is an allocation of the parts of the E, the S, or the G that make sense to the right committee. And so typically we're seeing the S, the social, which is diversity, equity, and inclusion, and employee wellness and human capital management, that getting pretty typically allocated to the compensation committee. The G typically gets allocated to the governance committee, but lots of my clients have a compensation and governance committee, so they've really got double duty to do here on the S and the G. And the E, the environmental, is typically allocated either to a health and safety committee in those more safety sensitive businesses like energy and mining, or it gets allocated to the risk committee. And in each case, though, we're seeing sort of full report ups to the board of the work that's being done by the committee. And in some cases where the issue is particularly critical to the business, maybe it's succession and talent development at the CEO level, or maybe it's a significant diversity issue, we'll see the board with primary responsibility and oversight for that issue.
I agree with what you're saying, and it's almost a year or so ago, 18 months, is I wouldn't say the Wild West, but it was all over the place on who had ESG and the oversight, and it is settling into those silos, like you said. What's interesting is you still have some companies that are at the board level, because this is ultimately a board discussion of who has this oversight. They want to keep ESG at the board level for now. It's too important. There's so much interest. To Chris's point, everyone's asking when the board comes together about all these topics, so they find themselves going through some of these topics over and over again. So they're trying to keep it at the board level, but what's appropriate, what isn't, but it does seem to fit with the social going to compensation and the others, as Chris said, but some keeping it at the board level. There isn't a right or wrong way to do this. It's just more, where's that expertise sit, and then how does your board want to manage that risk?
And as this progresses and we start to see more pay for ESG or more ESG metrics in incentive plans, I think we're going to see more committee, what I'm calling cross-committee collaboration, which means that the audit committee typically weighs in on financial measures, but you may have the risk committee weighing in on what are the right environmental measures and how do you assess performance. And so we are expecting to see more. The first part of the comp committee has audit or risk sitting in and moving on from there. So it's going to make for some interesting changes, certainly in how committees operate.
That's great. And as we wrap up here, one final question I just would ask you. So if you're speaking to a compensation committee that is experiencing this expansion of oversight in their role, what advice do you have for committees that are going through this change right now?
I can dive in there first, Chris. I would say that one is take your time, ask for the right analytics, have the right people in the room. This is what Chris said is a great point, is having, specifically in the DEI portion of it, having those expert resources come in, make a presentation, get informed is probably the first thing that we would recommend, in understanding the scope and breadth of just really how deep you want to go, because there could be whole meetings devoted to this topic, but really it's what's the right level, and really prodding the management team to make sure that they have this under control. They're working on DEI culture and talent initiatives.
The other thing I'd add is so much of what we do, everything really does start with the business and the business strategy. And you need to understand both what's going on in your business, where you have areas of real strength and areas where there's certainly opportunities, but also what really matters to your business, because this is not and won't be, I don't think, a one size fits all. Here's what you should be doing for ESG, and it fits across all companies. This will be very specific to industry, to the company strategy, which is one of the things that makes it very interesting.
Phenomenal. Thank you both for taking the time today. This was absolutely great.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
This episode is brought to you by Meridian Compensation Partners. Meridian works with compensation committees to ensure the most effective processes are in place to go beyond mere compliance with governance requirements and create healthy, dynamic relationships between the board, management, and its advisors. Meridian helps boards use compensation to attract and retain critical talent and to make informed business decisions that will link pay and performance, drive business results, increase shareholder value, and mitigate potential risks. Learn more at meridiancp.com. Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed this episode of the Executive Compensation Podcast. You can see more about this episode along with additional executive compensation insights at meridiancp.com. That's Meridian, the letter C, and the letter P.com.